Hello, I'm Cherise Speller, Chairman of Greenville Pitt Public Access Television, commonly known as GPAT. Today in our Citizenship series, we have Dr. Peter Francia. He is Director of the ECU Center for Survey Research, and he is Professor of Political Science at ECU. Today, he's here to talk about the misconceptions about state and national polls. And I have to admit, Dr. Francia, I'm a career journalist, so I'm fascinated by polls and watch them during the elections. And in my mind, I try to average them out to figure out the true picture, which I know is not scientific at all. But I'm glad you're here today to talk to us about the polls and the studies that you've done and watching them so we can all be more educated as we look at polls during election season. So thank you for being here with us, and please take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I wanted to start by saying that averaging the polls actually is a pretty good way of doing it. It's better than picking the one you like.
Cool.
Using that one. So I think you're off to a good start by looking at multiple polls and taking them all into consideration. So you said it isn't scientific, but I would say that's a pretty good way of doing it.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Do we wanted to share the screen? Is that correct?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put up my slides, and I think, can we see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so the title of the talk is Science or Voodoo: Misconceptions About National and State Election Polls. Before I begin, I wanted to mention that title is borrowed from a book chapter in a book that I write with Dr. Jody Baumgartner on American elections. So the title isn't wholly mine. I don't want to be accused of at least half plagiarism. So Jody Baumgartner, my co-author, gets at least half credit with me for that title. But I'll do the honors today of talking about some of the things that we already have discussed in that book chapter, but then updating with the 2020 election as well. I love the book chapter begins with this, and I think it's a good way to begin today's talk. The quotation comes from Humphrey Taylor, who's the chairman of the Harris poll. And the quote is, "I reword Winston Churchill's famous remarks about democracy and say, polls are the worst way of measuring public opinion or predicting elections, except for all the others." And I think by the time I get to the end of today's talk, you'll have a good sense of why I begin with that quotation. Polls are not perfect, but in the end, they do a better job than simply trying to guess what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So why do a talk today or a pop-up lecture on polling? And I think the simple answer to this is, first, polls are everywhere. Polls are ubiquitous. You really can't go through an election cycle, pick up a newspaper or go to your favorite website for news and not see at least one headline. Sometimes there's multiple ones, but at least one headline about the horse race coverage of the election. And the horse race coverage refers to, who's winning the race. And the only way we know who's ahead at a particular point in time before votes are cast is by looking at the polls. So there's this sort of insatiable desire among Americans to know who's winning and who's losing at various points in the election. And polls sort of do a good job of filling that void in the news cycle. And again, in that sort of that hunger for knowledge of what's the state of the race. Mm-hmm. Where polls fit in. And I think they certainly, in many respects, play a valuable role in the news cycle. But of course, they only do that if they're right. And I want to talk a little bit about a common complaint and I think debunk some of the misconceptions about polls getting it wrong, but also talk about where there are legitimate criticisms of polls. The polls are not by any stretch perfect. There's good and there's bad, and I want to break through the good and the bad in polling. I put in that last bullet point, why do we care about polls? The polls have been terrible. They've been getting it wrong. And again, I think there's more to it than that. Let's start first with why the negative perception. Why do people think that the pollsters, at least recently, have been so wrong? And I think we have to go back, not to 2020, but back to the cycle before go back to the 2016 presidential election. And these were actual quotes that were put out for people to read. One of my favorites comes from the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post used a forecasting model. So they took data from various polls and from other sources, and then create a forecasting model. And the forecasting model gave Hillary Clinton a 98.2% probability of victory. Now, to sort of put that number in perspective, that if you're a college football fan, that's like a kicker kicking an extra point. The NFL has moved back their extra point, but in the old days when it was really easy to make, kickers used to make them at about a 99% rate. So pretty close to that 98.2%. So almost automatic. This is a layup if you prefer basketball. This is a layup for Hillary Clinton. And the model says she's going to get 323 electoral college votes. Of course, the magic number is 270. So 323 would be well over the 270 needed for victory. So Clinton's going to win, right? The publication says, quote, Republican Donald Trump has essentially no path to an electoral college victory. Clinton should fairly easily hold on to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And that's really critical because it's those three states that are key to the forecasting model being so wrong. I'll get back to why in a little bit. New York Times, if you don't trust the Huffington Post, well, the New York Times gave Hillary Clinton an 85% probability of winning. Still, that's if you're going to put your money on a horse, you'll take one with an 85% probability of winning. Nate Silver's 538 website, which had gained a lot of attention because Nate Silver was incredibly accurate in the 2008 and the 2012 presidential elections. So a lot of people look to Nate Silver as offering almost a guaranteed way of knowing who was going to win ahead of time. And Nate Silver was on the lower side of probability for Clinton, but still gave her a 71.4% probability of winning. So again, the odds are very much with Clinton as we headed into the 2016 election. Of course, we know now that those probabilities ended up not giving us the correct answer on who won the election. Donald Trump ultimately won 304 electoral college votes. And after that election, it was pretty clear to anyone, right? The experts got it wrong. They made a mistake. Clinton did not win, Trump did. So clearly a mistake somewhere. And since the forecasting models, so much of their forecast came from polling data, it was then assumed that the polls got it wrong as well. Well, in 2020, it looked again to a lot of people like the pollsters had egg on their face. Donald Trump specifically made a point of calling out some of the incorrect polls in the aftermath of the 2020 election. In fact, the day after the election, Donald Trump specifically pointed out Quinnipiac University's poll concerning the state of Florida. Quinnipiac had given Joe Biden a 5-point advantage heading into the right before Election Day, and Trump ended up winning the state of Florida by 3 points. In fact, Trump's direct quote was, "The day before the election, Quinnipiac, which was wrong on every occasion that I know of, had Joe Biden up by 5 points in Florida, and they were off by 8.4 points. I won Florida easily. They had me losing Florida by a lot, and I ended up winning Florida by a lot." So I don't do a very good Trump impersonation, but those were his exact words to the election. And again, while my impersonation of Trump may not be very good, at least on that particular poll in the state of Florida, Trump is right that Florida, the Quinnipiac poll in Florida, did get it wrong. And when you're wrong by 8.4 points in pollsters, in the universe of pollsters, that is getting it wrong. So polls did get some things wrong in 2020 as well. The entire narrative that the pollsters really don't know what they're doing or got it all wrong in 2016 and in 2020 ignores a lot of important points that I think we need to correct. So let's start with whether the narrative that the pollsters can't do their jobs right, they made all these incorrect predictions. Let's cut through that a little bit. National polls in 2016, if you were to take them all together and aggregate them and average them, There's a website, realclearpolitics.com, that does this for people who check into their website. And Real Clear Politics did the averaging for everybody. And on the day of the election, it gave Hillary Clinton an average lead of 3 points. That's taking all the polls, averaging them. Clinton's lead on the day of the election in 2016 was 3 percentage points. You're going to say, well, of course, Trump won, so clearly they got it wrong. But polls don't give us a sense of the electoral college total. They give us a sense of what the popular vote is going to look like, right? They're asking individual voters across the country. So the polls are replicating, at least national polls, are replicating something that would be much more equivalent to the popular vote total than the electoral college vote total. Look at the popular vote total. Well, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2 percentage points. So the polls saying Clinton up 3, and then she wins the popular vote by 2. Anybody that can do pretty basic math can figure out from that the polls were only off by 1 percentage point. They had Clinton winning by 3, and she won the popular vote by 2. So only a difference of 1 point. So were the polls terrible? Were they awful? Were they wrong? If you can get within 1 percentage point, I think a reasonable person can conclude that the polls were actually quite accurate in 2016. How did that compare with actual previous cycles? If you go back to the 2012 election, the one right before the 2016 presidential election, the polls actually were worse. They got the correct winner, and I think this is why we didn't look at 2012 and say, why did they get it wrong? The national polls had Barack Obama up by a little bit less than 1 percentage point if you averaged all the polls. So very, very, very close election according to the polls. And when it was all said and done, Barack Obama won the presidential election, at least by the popular vote, by 4 percentage points. So the polls were off 3 points. They had Obama winning by about 1, according to the polls, and Obama won by 4. So the polls actually underestimated Democratic support in 2012, and they were off by 3 percentage points. But in 2016, again, they were only off 1. So actually the polls did a little bit better by that metric in 2012 than they did in 2016. Well, if you go back a little bit further to 1980, there was no Real Clear Politics to average all the polls for us, but the Gallup organization is regarded as, at least certainly in 1980, would be pegged as perhaps the most accurate pollster in the business in 1980. And the Gallup poll gave Ronald Reagan a 3-point lead, 47-44, over President Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan would go on to win the popular vote over Carter by more than 10 percentage points. So in 1980, you had the most reputable pollster on the planet off by 7 percentage points in 1980. So 2016, again, looks pretty good by comparison. Still, again, the forecasting polls, which I mentioned earlier, are based largely on polling data, still picked the wrong winner. And the question is why? What did they get wrong? If they were so close with the national polls, where did the mistakes happen? And we have to go back to 3 key states in 2016: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those states were wrong in the polls. The history of all 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, had voted for the Democratic Party's nominee for president in every presidential election cycle from 1992 all the way through the 2012 election. So heading into 2016, there was a reasonable expectation, given that history, that recent history, that those 3 states, even if it was close, that you had to sort of give the edge to the Democratic candidates. So Hillary Clinton in 2016, even though some of the polls, individual polls, were showing that it was tightening in those 3 states. Again, the averages showed a lead for Clinton, but those state level polls did prove to be wrong. So what happened? Why were the pollsters, at least at the state level, wrong in those 3 key states? By the way, I should point out, in case people may not know this, those 3 states, had they gone for Hillary Clinton, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, instead of for Donald Trump in 2016, then Hillary Clinton would have been elected president of the United States. So that's why the focus of these 3 states is so critical. So why were the state level polls wrong? Why did they see Clinton winning when in fact Donald Trump won those 3 states? And first answer to this is there are always undecided voters, even right up until election day. So the pollsters get out there and they ask voters, what their voting preferences are. And there's always a small slice of the population that will tell the pollster they're truly undecided. There are a small percentage of Americans who literally may not make up their minds until actually, pulling up to their polling place and casting their ballots. And in the 3 states that I've been talking about, undecided voters there was a rather high percentage of them, at least compared to 2020, as high as 13% in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So more than 1 in 10 were at least telling the pollsters they were undecided right up until election day. And those undecided voters, we know now in asking them through the exit polls and through subsequent research, those undecided voters broke disproportionately for Donald Trump. So the pollster isn't going to know that in advance. And there's really no easy way to have expected to know in advance that undecided voters were going to break disproportionately for Donald Trump, at least by the margins that they ultimately did. So that was a factor. And it was really nothing that the pollsters could have done to anticipate that. But it explains why there were mistakes made in at least those 3 states. There is another factor, and this is a bit on this is something that does fall on the shoulders of pollsters for getting this part wrong. We now know, at least looking back at some of these state level polls, that a number of state level polls did not take into consideration the education levels of their respondents. Now, what a good poll should always do is it should strive for representation. You should try to make sure that your poll looks like the electorate, right? Electorate, because in a poll about elections, it wouldn't be about the population as a whole, it would be about the people who actually vote. So you're talking about the electorate, and you want your sample to look as close as possible to the actual electorate. And in the case of those 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, there was an overrepresentation of college graduates. And this may or may not have mattered in some election cycles, but in 2016 it did. And the reason it mattered is that a disproportionate number of college graduates broke much more heavily for Hillary Clinton than they did for Donald Trump. So if you have too many in one group and they're breaking disproportionately for one candidate versus another, you're going to get some mistakes in your final results in the polls. Now, again, so this overrepresentation of college graduates led to an overestimation of support for Hillary Clinton because, again, they broke disproportionately for her. Another way of looking at this is to look at the numbers a slightly different way. We can look at the people who don't have a 4-year college degree, and specifically white voters without a 4-year college degree, because those voters over the last several presidential cycles have been moving increasingly in the direction of voting more and more for Republican candidates for president. In 2020, Mitt Romney was able to win that block of voters by a 62 to 36 percentage point advantage. So the difference there was a Romney advantage among that group of 26 percentage points. Fast forward 4 years later, from 2012 to 2016, and Donald Trump has expanded that margin among whites without a 4-year college degree from Romney's 26-point advantage over Obama. Trump has a 37-point advantage over Clinton. He won the vote of whites without a 4-year college degree by a 66 to 29 percentage point advantage. So again, a margin of 37 percentage points. So Trump winning by 37 among that block, Romney 4 years earlier at 26 points. So Trump, increased that advantage among that block of voters. And since the polls missed a lot of those voters and didn't anticipate them voting in the numbers that they did, and for Trump, it magnified the error. And in those 3 states, that block of voters was an important block in determining the eventual outcomes. It was very, very close. So just a few percentage points here or there made the difference. Now, if you have bad polling data in 3 key states and you plug bad polling data into a mathematical forecasting model, you're going to get incorrect predictions. The computer is not does not have a time machine that it can go into the future and tell us who wins and then come back. What it relies on is the human beings who go out there and collect the data. So in this case, the pollsters who are out bringing the data. That data then gets punched into the computer. The computer assumes the data are correct and then gives you a prediction from that. I happen to love this quote from the book Standard Deviations. The author is Gary Smith, and Gary Smith says, "Garbage in, garbage out is a snappy reminder of the fact that if a computer's calculations are based on bad data, the output is not gospel, but garbage." And so if you want to understand why the Huffington Post had a 98.2% probability of victory for Clinton, and the New York Times and 538 and these others had forecasting models confidently predicting a Clinton victory, part of the reason that those forecasts were wrong is that the state level polling data in 3 key states ended up being incorrect. Well, what happened in 2020, you might ask? Were the national polls off there as well? Well, the polls on average had Joe Biden up by 7 percentage points. Biden ended up winning by about 4.5 percentage points in the popular vote. So again, if you take the difference between 7 and 4.5, the polls were off by about 2.5 percentage points. Again, that's not terrible by historical standards to be off by only 2.5 percentage points. Again, certainly better than the 1980 example that I referenced earlier, and actually just a tad bit better even than the 2012 election. But still, it was not all good in 2020. There were, once again, mistakes that were made in several key states that I wanted to highlight. In the state of Wisconsin, I think this state more than any other, and here we are yet again talking about Wisconsin. Wisconsin had some polls that were very, very far off in the 2020 election. The averages, if you took all the polls and averaged them, Joe Biden led by 7 percentage points on election day, according to the polls. And when it was all said and done on election day, Joe Biden won Wisconsin, but by less than 1 percentage point. So it was a nail biter in Wisconsin, a Biden victory, but a nail biter, and not nearly the comfortable 7-point victory that the average of the polls suggested. But it gets worse than that. The ABC News Washington Post, which has over the years had a very good reputation, have a reputation of being very good, reputable in producing good polling data, and but they were about as off as you could possibly be in the state of Wisconsin. The ABC News Washington Post poll had Joe Biden up an astounding 17 percentage points in Wisconsin. And of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, Biden won by less than 1 point. So to be off by 16 percentage points is not just to be wrong, but to be remarkably wrong. So really, really almost incredible to believe mistake by a really good pollster. The New York Times and Siena poll, another excellent poll, had Biden up 11. And again, to be off by 10 percentage points is a large margin to be off by. The Reuters Ipsos poll, another good one, had Biden up 10. So these are 3 really good pollsters who had Biden winning very easily in Wisconsin. And of course, the reality was something very, very different. So Wisconsin, yet again, had some pollsters that really had it wrong in that state. Iowa is another one in 2020 where the polls really seem to be quite a bit off. The polls consistently were showing that Iowa was going to be a competitive state. A lot of people, political scientists like myself, didn't anticipate that at the beginning of the 2020 election. Iowa was looked at as a state that should go Republican, but the polls kept saying it was close, close, close. In fact, PPP, which is another very good pollster, headquarters right here in Raleigh, North Carolina, had Biden up in Iowa by 1 in their most recent poll right before Election Day. Quinnipiac, very good pollster as well, had Trump up by only 1. So there was some optimism in among Democrats that Iowa was in play and that Biden could even win. And the average of the polls, again, only had Trump up 2. When it was all said and done, Iowa went for Trump by 8 percentage points, which was a fairly comfortable victory for Trump and more in line with what most political scientists expected from the very beginning. So the polls, again, were showing something close that really wasn't. Florida, third state, where there were some pretty serious mistakes. Polls had Biden up if you took all the averages, and Trump won by 3. Monmouth University's poll had Biden up 6, Quinnipiac, Biden up 5. Again, a 3-point Trump victory. So a third state where the polling, was quite a bit off from the actual result. So what explains the errors in 2020? Did the pollsters repeat the same errors as before, or were there new mistakes that were made? Okay, well, before you can see on this slide some of the speculative answers about what they got wrong. I do want to point out that the same mistakes were not made. There were corrections made in a number of state level polls that adjusted and corrected for some of the sampling problems that I mentioned earlier about oversampling whites with a 4-year college degree. That got corrected and actually showed promise. In the 2018 midterm elections, the pollsters were very accurate. So there was a lot of optimism heading into 2020 that the key mistake on sampling that was made in a number of those state polls in 2016 had been fixed, had been corrected, adjustments had been made. 2018 proved that the mistakes had been remedied because the polls were accurate in that midterm election. And so the expectation was that in 2020, there would be better results from the polls. Can you guys hear that?
Somebody's just agreeing with you.
Okay. All right. So now here are some of the speculative answers to what explains the errors in the 2020 election. First, we know that, and this was done from subsequent polls, that Donald Trump voters are much more likely than other voters to not trust the media or universities. And many polls typically come from these sources. We talked earlier about the New York Times or about the ABC News, the Washington Post polls. So a number of polls identify themselves when they do a poll, and polls are coming from, again, universities or from media. And if you don't trust those sources, you may hang up and not take part in the poll. And if that happens, it can create some problems because you end up with something called response bias. We'll get to that in a minute. But there were, again, these weighting adjustments, and weighting adjustments do try to correct for some of these problems. The problem is that if you are trying to correct for any imbalances, if the Trump voter specifically is more likely to say no, there will be some white working class whites without a 4-year degree who will be voting for Joe Biden, right? And there will be a large number that will be voting for Donald Trump. If that Trump faction, however, is much more likely than the Biden faction among that group to say, hey, we're not answering our phones, we're not talking to these people because we don't trust them, then you're going to see an inflated number for Biden among certain blocks of voters. And certainly, even if you're weighting your data to make sure you have enough whites without a 4-year degree, if you're only getting the people who trust the media and they're disproportionately likely to be Biden voters, then you're going to get mistakes again in the results that you receive. So that's at least one speculative answer to this. I had mentioned again that the 2018 election showed a lot of promise in the fact that they tended to be very accurate relative to 2016. So the midterm polls seem to be doing much better. So another speculative answer is that there's a Trump factor that nobody can sort of anticipate, that it's hard to poll people who are supporters of Trump. This is what, and I put it in the last slide, but I'll bring it up again, what some call the shy Trump voter. So there are, at least this is a speculative answer, that there are people out there who are, they go into the polls, they vote for Trump, but they don't want to tell anybody that. And in 2018, Donald Trump's not on the ballot and the polls look accurate. 2016, they make some mistakes, at least some of those states that I mentioned. 2020, the same thing. And the key variable might be that we're talking about Trump now, where we weren't in 2018. So maybe it's a Trump factor. I will add this. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, AAPOR, which is the professional association for survey researchers and pollsters, did look into that possible hypothesis of the shy Trump voter. And the shy Trump voter, there was really no support for that, according to AAPOR. But there are professionals in the field, some of whom that I've spoken to, that think that that's still a possibility. So I don't want to discount it completely. It's certainly one to think about, but at least when the best of the best, so to speak, looked into that as an explanation for 2016, there was not a lot of evidence to support it. However, we haven't looked at that explanation yet for 2020, and it's certainly one that some have still offered. So I wanted to at least mention it as a possible explanation. I think now we're going to get into some of the real reasons that 2020 may have made some errors, at least in a few states. And I think these are perhaps the reasons to focus most on. Pollsters have to figure out likely voters. And this is always a challenge for a pollster, to try and figure out which voters are likely to vote and which ones aren't. And there are a number of different ways that pollsters have done it over the years. Some ask voters a battery of questions, and from those questions determine who's likely to vote and who isn't. Some pollsters look at past voting history to see if at least the household that they've contacted has a history of voting. And so there are a number of ways that pollsters do it. And again, there's no one uniform way of doing it. But we do know this about 2020. It set records for the number of votes cast. It was a record high turnout election. And there was no way of predicting that heading into 2020. There was speculation that it could be a high turnout year, but the numbers were so astronomically high in 2020 that it would have been hard for anybody to predict just how high the turnout numbers reached. And so it's very possible that in the polls, there were people who actually voted, but weren't treated as likely voters by the pollsters. So you're throwing people out that you shouldn't have thrown out from your sample, and that can lead to some mistakes. And there is some reason to believe that that may have been a factor. And I'll give you an example. The CNN poll had Joe Biden up 10 points in the state of Pennsylvania among likely voters. And yet they also asked in that poll, not just likely voters, but they also sampled just simply registered voters. And among registered voters, Biden led by 5 percentage points, but 10 percentage points, as I mentioned a minute ago, among likely voters. Now, this is very odd to a political scientist because the rule of thumb has almost always been that the registered voter number is going to be higher for the Democrat and the likely voter number is going to be better for the Republican. And CNN heading into the election had it the other way around. They had Biden doing better with likely voters and worse among registered voters. And usually it's the other way around. So something looked a little funky in Pennsylvania when they were looking at likely voters. And it suggests perhaps that maybe there were some mistakes made with who the likely voters were in Pennsylvania in that poll. The ABC News Washington Post poll had Biden with a 7-point lead among likely voters, but only a 4-point lead among registered voters. So a different pollster, different state, right? The same pattern. It's backwards. It has Biden doing better among likely voters than among registered voters when history tells us it's almost always the other way around. So it's very, very possible that there were mistakes made in trying to estimate who likely voters were from what actually happened at the polls in 2020. I think the second major factor that I put the most weight on, so that's the first one, as I mentioned a minute ago. The second one that I would point out, so likely voters, the first reason. The second one will be the pandemic. One pollster noted that after the lockdown, Democrats were more likely to be home than Republicans. And that meant that they were more likely to be home, of course, to take surveys and polls when we're calling, when pollsters are out there making phone calls to a home, or even there are pollsters now doing some of the polls via text and via online it can be through a computer. So it's certainly, if you're home, you have more free time, presumably. I know that a lot of people were home and they had tons of responsibilities going on, but again, it's different environment than being physically someplace else. And that may have made Democrats more likely to respond to the polls simply because they were more likely to be home during the pandemic. And this is backed up by the observations of David Shore, who's a Democratic pollster who worked on Barack Obama's campaign in 2012. He was quoted as saying, nearly all of the national polling error in 2020 can be explained by the post-COVID jump in response rates among Democrats. So that's a professional pollster who, based on his years of experience, attributing some of the mistakes made in 2020 to the dynamics of the pandemic and who was home and who wasn't. And there's additional circumstantial evidence to back up that observation. There were polls were reporting much higher response rates than in years immediately previous to it. And so if there were more people, a response rate is you make the phone call and somebody hangs up, then you didn't get the person. If somebody does, then you got the person. The more people you get, the higher the response rate. And those response rates were much higher. There were people more eager to take these polls than in previous years. And again, presumably because people are in lockdown in their homes. So a lot of the polls were showing that Joe Biden seemed to be doing best in coronavirus hotspots. And the conventional wisdom at the time, and I'll confess, as somebody who looked at it this way as well during the cycle, the conventional interpretation was that the virus itself and the politics surrounding the virus, and specifically President Trump's handling of the virus, that if Biden was doing better than expected in coronavirus hotspots, that it reflected people's unhappiness with Trump's handling of the pandemic. And that's why Biden was doing better than expected. It may not have been that at all. It may not have been voters, expressing dissatisfaction. What it may have been instead was we were just, as pollsters, more likely to get Democrats on the phone in those coronavirus hotspots. So it wasn't a reflection on something negative towards Trump or something positive towards Biden. It was simply, again, a function of who was home to take the surveys and who might not have been home at least as frequently to take the surveys. And so again, it may not have been that there was this big shift towards Biden, but rather again, more just evidence of who was able to take the survey and who wasn't. And if we look at the state of Wisconsin, it seems to really fit this. Wisconsin was one of the nation's current hotspots during the time of the election. And the polls there, as I mentioned earlier, tremendously underestimated support for Donald Trump in that state. And again, the Washington Post poll that had Biden up 17, there was, again, conventional interpretation was voters were angry with Trump in Wisconsin because of the pandemic. And again, it may not have been that at all. It may have been simply who was home to take the surveys and who wasn't. And for example, if you look at the New York Times Siena poll, Joe Biden was gaining heading into the state of Wisconsin, it was gaining in Wisconsin. So his numbers were going up the closer we were getting to the election. And the reason that's is worth mentioning is that trends everywhere else seem to be going the other way. Trump seemed to be gaining on Biden nationally as we're getting closer and closer to election day. So Biden had a bigger lead nationally, and that lead was shrinking, and yet Wisconsin was doing the opposite. And so it may have been simply that, again, it was just bad. Well, the responses that we were getting from pollsters were getting from Wisconsin may have been from a disproportionate share of Democrats rather than any sort of major shift. And in fact, we know there didn't appear to be any major shifts towards Biden because of how close it was on election day in Wisconsin. Florida offers a somewhat different explanation, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. Florida ended up going for Donald Trump, and a number of polls had Biden ahead. As I mentioned, two prominent ones, Monmouth and Quinnipiac, had Biden up 5 to 6 points, which is, would be a very big victory for a Democrat in a state like Florida. And of course, Trump won by 3. One of the things that surprised political scientists and pollsters in the aftermath of the election was to look at the breakdowns among Hispanic voters. Now, Cuban voters in Florida are historically Republican, so it's not a shock when Republicans win Cuban voters. But the Hispanic number overall, there are obviously more, there's quite a bit of diversity in the Hispanic community in Florida. There's an increasingly large Puerto Rican population, for example, in Florida. And the Puerto Rican population is disproportionately, votes disproportionately for Democrats. And so when you take the entire Latino Hispanic population into account in Florida, and you look at 2016, Hillary Clinton did quite well among Latinos overall in Florida. And the expectation was that Joe Biden would at least be able to equal what Hillary Clinton was able to do in Florida, if not do better, given that in the national polls, Biden seemed to be running from a place of strength relative to Clinton 4 years earlier. And it turned out that the numbers for Joe Biden were noticeably worse than he underperformed relative to Hillary Clinton. In Miami-Dade County, for example, Joe Biden won by 7 points in a county that Hillary Clinton had carried by 29 percentage points. So an enormous difference in just 4 years. And really no pollster saw that coming. So there are always these factors that sometimes escape forecasting models, and pollsters could, sometimes miss and can't anticipate. So there were, other examples as well. The New York Times Siena poll had Biden with a 55-33 advantage among Hispanic voters, and in the final totals, Biden was barely able to win the Hispanic vote overall in the state of Florida. So the polls weren't able to capture the Hispanic vote correctly in Florida. And I think a reasonable question is why. And I think that's part of what pollsters will dissect over the next year, is to figure out what happened in Florida and why the polls were wrong and the expectations were wrong in Florida. One last thing that I want to mention about how I think people should interpret polls moving forward. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I want to correct this, make these important points for point of correction. Polls are often reported in a binary way. And what do I mean by that? They're reported as either somebody is winning or somebody is losing in the polls. So you might see a headline that says, Biden leads in North Carolina by 1 over Trump. Well, the poll may say, Biden is at 50, Trump is at 49. And to a person picking up the newspaper or logging, going online and looking at their headline, they'll say, oh, well, Biden with a 1-point lead in North Carolina, Biden's going to win North Carolina. Well, that's not correct. Polls are not making predictions, they're making estimates. And those estimates always come with what's called a margin of error. That means there's sort of like I guess I would describe it as like a fudge factor. You don't really you're not making a perfect guess with a poll. It's really an estimate. And that estimate usually is with a plus or minus of 3 points for each candidate. So 50 to 49 is really not saying that Biden will win by 1. It's saying that add plus or minus 3 to both of those numbers. You could have Joe Biden with 47 theoretically, and Trump with 52 theoretically, and at least adding that plus or minus 3, in which case then Trump has won North Carolina. Polls are really only wrong when they're outside that margin of error. That should not happen. And when that does happen, then I think people are right in saying, hey, the polls got that wrong. But the estimate, the person looking at the poll should always be aware of that there's going to be that margin of error. So polls are estimates, remember, not predictions. And you always have to add in that margin of error. Now, I should add, it's not always plus or minus 3. In some polls, especially ones that are done during the primary phase of the election, the sample might be smaller. And if the sample size is smaller, that is, you do a poll of fewer voters, then the margin of error will increase. You might have it might be plus or minus 4. Usually you'll see it. There's a little in any poll. There's a methodology section somewhere buried in the notes. You'll see that margin of error statistic. And so as somebody who reports those numbers myself, when I do polls, we always include that. If you're out there looking at a poll, always be sure to factor that in. Last thing that I wanted to mention about challenges and opportunities for polls going forward. One of the challenges is that there is an increasing problem of low response rates. Now, I did mention that during the pandemic, response rates did improve, but by 2024, the expectation certainly is that we won't be in a COVID-19 world anymore. And it has become increasingly difficult to get people to respond to polls. There are low response rates. And if there are low response rates, you run the risk of missing some important segments of the electorate. And so that becomes a problem. You don't want to sample to miss key segments of the electorate. And low response rates present at least the potential for that problem. There's also a lack of trust that I had mentioned. I think this is something to really, this is a real challenge for pollsters. If one group of voters on one side of the partisan aisle, specifically in this case, Republicans, if Republicans are going to be less trusting of universities and of the media and are going to refuse to do polls relative to Democrats, that presents another challenge for pollsters to overcome. And there are a variety of ideas and strategies to address that, but that does present a serious challenge and one that pollsters will have to look at, because if they don't, then you're likely to continue to get overestimations of Democratic support, and it will make pollsters look wrong, or worse, it will make it look like pollsters and the people who are behind those polls in the media or at universities may have an agenda to put forward higher support for a Democrat than what actually happens on election day. And that's the worst thing that could happen, because then the problem of trust will only get worse. So an honest error might not look like an honest error to people. It may look like there's an agenda. And if that happens, then the lack of trust will only increase. So pollsters really have to figure out ways to make sure that they're getting enough Republicans who are out there to take part in these polls and these surveys, or they're going to get numbers that don't look right on election day. I will say this: there are some promising developments in the world of polling. Just about an astronomically high percentage of Americans have cell phones, and it's easier than ever now to take surveys and to do polls through convenient technologies online. This can be done through a cell phone. This can be done from a desktop computer. We don't have to be home at 8 o'clock at night after we've just finished dinner or just finished cleaning the dishes or whatever, and we're relaxing in front of the TV, right? We want to chill out, and then the phone rings, right? Pollsters will still use phones, and that's still a way that they'll reach people, but it's not the only way. And I think the convenience that we have now through online technologies gives pollsters the opportunity to reach voters in a way that's more convenient. And if it's more convenient, it should help reach more and more people. And of course, there's always this segment of the electorate, right, they may work at night, right? They may have odd hours and they may be difficult to reach. One of the nice things about online surveys is if you get it, you can take it anytime that's convenient. You don't have to take it when the pollster calls your house, which may be at an inconvenient time. And so I think that offers possibilities for polls to get even better as that technology perfects itself and as it becomes more and more a part of mainstream polling. All right, so conclusions. I started with the question, is polling an art, science, or some form of modern voodoo? I think the answer to the question is that, well, polling certainly does rely on standards that I think you could describe as scientific, but it is hardly an exact science. And there are certainly things to look for as an educated consumer of polls to distinguish between good polls and bad polls, because while I think the vast majority of polls do a very good job, certainly by historical standards, there are some bad polls that come out from time to time. And I think these are three things to look for. The source of the poll is important. Look at the history of the pollster. Does the pollster have a track record of being accurate in the past, or at least close to being accurate, or have the results been wrong in the past? I would also, look at not just the track record, but dig into the source itself. There are some pollsters out there that are affiliated more with one party than the other. Always be cautious there. But if it's a university poll or a poll from a reputable news media organization, at least by historical standards, there's no reason not to trust those polls. There were, as I pointed out, some mistakes made in 2020. But if you're taking the long view, those polls have in the past been very accurate. So look at that, look at the source, and look at the track record. Look at the sampling. Look at how those who participated in the poll or survey were recruited, and then look at the weighting strategies. It's very rare that a sample will come back perfectly, and so pollsters have to engage in what's called weighting. So they'll put a little more weight into a voter from a segment of the electorate that might not have responded to that poll in the numbers that were necessary. And so look at the weighting strategies. Those will be explained in the methodology of the poll as well. And that can tell you that certainly in 2016, the fact that there were polls that didn't weight by education level, that would have been something that if you read the methodology, any person could have noticed that. And in fact, that's how people looking back on 2016 after the election did in fact do that, and noticed that there were a number of state polls that weren't weighting by education level. So look for things like that. If you see a poll, for example, still not doing that, then I would take that poll with a grain of salt. And then finally, I think one of the big challenges and something that every educated consumer of polls should look for is how likely voters are determined by the source. Because again, if the likely voters are determined incorrectly, it will throw off all the numbers. So that's all I have with my poll, or with my discussion, excuse me. And if there are any questions that you wanted to ask me, Sherry, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. I am just fascinated, by polls and the information you presented. And thinking about the lack of trust that people have, how much information do pollsters have about the people that they're contacting? I mean, do you have my name, my number, my address, just how much information do you have that might make me and others feel better about answering the polls?
Well, I can say, at least on my end at ECU, let me start by answering from my end. I don't have any of your information. So I have, when ECU does a poll, we have an online vendor. I write the survey, or I write the poll. I put it up into the software, and then there's a link to it. And then we have a vendor who puts out the link to the survey. And then we have, I've put in advance some screen questions to make sure you live in North Carolina, if it's a North Carolina poll, and some other things. But the data that I get back doesn't tell me really anything about you other than what you tell me. So I'll have questions about, well, what's your age, what's your education level, ethnicity and race, gender, those questions, because we want to make sure that we have represented all these different blocks in the electorate properly, right? If we have a sample that comes back disproportionate, I'll give you an example. Women tend to be much more likely, at least in my experience of doing the online side of the polls, to do the online polls than men are. So, we would have bad numbers if we didn't correct for that. So if I see coming in, oh my God, 70% of my polls so far, I have women, I'll then add a screen question and say, okay, now if you tell me you're a woman, you can't take it anymore because I have enough. Right. And I need men now to get caught up, right? So on my end as a pollster, I don't see things, but I think in the world of professional polling, they will buy phone numbers, and there's going to be information certainly about some of the, the history of some of the people that they're reaching out to. But at least on the ECU side, everything's anonymous, and we just go on what you're willing to share with us.
Right.
For anyone's name, we don't do that. We're not, we want to respect people's privacy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so what kind of polling do you think you all will do as the 2022 elections are coming up? And, as a journalist, it sounds very exciting with all of these people pitching in for the senator seat for North Carolina. And I'm sure they all won't stay before the election comes. But the kinds of things that you generally plan at the center for these kinds of elections.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think even more immediate than 2022, there's in 2021, there are two gubernatorial elections.
Mm-hmm.
Is in Virginia. So we neighbor Virginia, and the Center for Survey Research, our ECU poll, got involved in South Carolina as well. So we were a little bit more than a North Carolina poll. We didn't want to bite off more than we could chew. It was our first rodeo, as they say, the 2020 election. So we kept it to the Carolinas, but now having gotten our feet wet, we're ready to sort of branch out. So we will be active in doing at least a few polls in Virginia. I haven't made a decision yet on New Jersey, but there's a possibility that if New Jersey looks like it's for some reason competitive, then
Mm-hmm.
in fact look at New Jersey. For what it's worth, I was born and raised. Well, actually, no, I was born in New York, but I was raised in New Jersey, and so it's my home state. So I have sort of a personal interest in it. But if New Jersey has trended Democrat to the Democratic Party in at least in recent elections, although of course Chris Christie won 2 terms as governor there, but it's been a more Democratic state of late. And if it looks like the Democrats will win easily, then I probably will stay out of it. But if the Republicans put up a good fight, and sometimes they do, then we may be active in New Jersey as well. But definitely Virginia in 2021 and perhaps New Jersey. 2022 is your question. We'll definitely be involved in the Senate race in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be a battleground. North Carolina will once again be a battleground state and control the Senate right now. Of course, just if one seat even flips,
right,
Democrat to Republican, the whole balance of power changes there. And so literally every race that could even remotely be close is going to be followed by the national media, and
mm-hmm.
reason to expect in an open seat race in North Carolina that we're going to have a close competitive race, and that the national media, not only the local and state, but the national media will be focusing on North Carolina. So we want to get in on that.
Yeah. Sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Yeah, we do. We have fun. That's a good word for it. Unless you're wrong, Sharon.
Right. Right.
I mean, I would say that the ECU poll, we were on the whole, I thought I was really happy with the results that we had, but we weren't perfect. Still things for us to improve and get better at. But, some races we were right on. We had Mark Robinson in our last poll winning by 4 percentage points, and he won by exactly 4 percentage points. Mm-hmm. We actually had a poll with Tom Tillis ahead when every major pollster had Cunningham up 5 or more, but our last poll had Cunningham up 1.
Right.
Like I said earlier, that's not really wrong because there's that -3. We said in our last report, look, it could go either way. It's that close. Because we had polls with Tillis ahead, and we had a poll, with Cunningham up 1. So we knew it was going to be really, really close, and it was really, really close. There were a lot of people at Cunningham up 10 or more. Those polls got it wrong. So those got it wrong. The ones that said, hey, look, like ours is going to be close. But, I would have liked, I'm not going to lie, even though technically I can say here we were within the margin of error, would have liked it to have just, had Tillis ahead, because then we would say, wow, we had Tillis ahead too. So we're going to work on getting that little bit better, at least if we can, heading into 2021 and 2022.
Does knowing a little bit about, like the state of North Carolina, for example, weigh in on how you look at the polls? Because, from my perspective, I was always doubtful about polls that had Cunningham ahead just because, it's North Carolina and I've been here all my life and I see how it generally goes. So,
Well,
I
you
didn't
never
want.
know, right? And I'll tell you why. If the numbers are the numbers and we go with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if they looked, I guess if there was a poll that looked, if we had numbers that looked suspiciously bad, like way off the charts, that would certainly factor into any decision about maybe we need to do it again. I've never had to, haven't had to do that in North Carolina with a poll, that came that way. But let me give you an example. You said, Cunningham up 10. Our polls never had that. And
Okay.
tell you honestly, just knowing what I know about North Carolina, like you do, I kept thinking, I think our numbers, just my gut tells me based on history that I like where our numbers look relative to others. But I get nervous when I see other polls kept showing Cunningham up by a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I got nervous about that was Kay Hagan won by about 10 percentage points over Elizabeth Dole in 2008. So
Mm-hmm.
just swamped a Republican. And it was Elizabeth Dole, right? I mean, Elizabeth Dole is a household name. She was a presidential candidate.
Right.
And Kay Hagan, yes, it was a huge year for Democrats in 2008. But if Biden is up 7 points, that's about where Obama was ahead in the polls in 08.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking going, well, if Biden replicates what Obama did in 2008, Kay Hagan won by 10. Maybe Cal Cunningham wins by 10 too, and we're going to be wrong. The bottom line is, while I'm thinking about all of those things as a political scientist and looking, all I could do is just say, look, this is what we got. This is what.
Right.
Let's trust what we're doing and put them out there and pray on election day with rules, right? And I think, at least we passed that test.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do look, Quinnipiac had the ABC News Washington Post poll, right, in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a nightmare. That would be one that I'm beyond, I'd lose sleep over a bad poll like that, because it would bother me that much. But they'll go on. Like, they're not going to stop doing it, and they'll probably have way more good polls than bad.
Right.
They're asking the same questions you and I are right now. How can they get better? How can they improve? And, I've gotten the opportunity over the years to get a chance to talk to people who do this much longer than I've been doing it. And I can assure everybody who's listening, every pollster who does it, their prime motivation is they want to be right.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to be wrong. You look like a fool in America when you're wrong.
Right.
So nobody wants to be wrong. They're all doing their best to get it right. So even when you see what you think looks like a crazy number, remember, there's somebody behind that number who's putting their reputation to an extent behind that number. And
Mm-hmm.
right. So I hope people listening dismiss any sort of conspiracy theories that you might have or suspicions about motivations. The motivation is simply, let's get it right, so that we look good. There's, again, nothing worse than having the conversation about, we made this mistake or we made that mistake. Nobody wants to go on television or on radio and have to explain why they got something wrong. It's a much better conversation to have, to brag about all the things that you got.
Yeah, right. That's true.
So that's something to remember. And at least I can certainly say that from my end. I sort of, again, put a lot of hard work and a lot of thought into making sure that everything we do is as good as it can possibly be. And then, then you cross your fingers and hope on election day that it comes out the way you think it's going to come out.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Dr. Francia, we thank you so much for your time today and imparting this great information. Looking forward to hopefully more conversations as time goes on and elections occur. We'd like to do our best to try to keep people aware of what's going on and kind of educate along the way too. So we thank you so much for helping us do that today on GPAT.
Thank you so much, Sherry. It's a pleasure to talk about a topic that I love so much.
Yeah, me too. Glad to have you here.